to welcome you to the webinar scheduled today, Managing the State Exam Process. I'd like to take just a moment to make a few round introductions. So first, I'm Brandi Reynolds. I'll be your host today. I have over 20 years of compliance experience. I'm currently the managing director here at Bates Group. I was also the founder of a consulting firm specializing in various types of financial service compliance. And prior to that, I was in-house as a chief compliance officer for over 11 years. Now I have the fun of serving in various outsourced compliance officer roles for a variety of type of different financial institutions. We have also your moderator, John Ashley. John Ashley is a managing consultant here at Bates, and he has over 7 years of experience in financial regulatory compliance with startups such as World Remit and Etana Custody. He specializes in establishing and maintaining a robust and productive working relationship with U.S. financial regulators. John has experience in compliance programs, policy and procedure development, product compliance, regulatory analysis, and consumer protection programs. Additionally, John has experience in the cryptocurrency compliance space, including the development of KYC and transaction monitoring programs and procedures specific to cryptocurrency risk. He also specializes in U.S. data privacy compliance and holds a CIPP U.S. certification from the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We have a great lineup of panelists. First, we have Daniel Wood. Daniel is a member of Pillsbury's FinTech Payments and Blockchain team and the Cybersecurity Data Protection and Privacy team. As a former attorney for the Texas Department of Banking, Daniel is uniquely able to advise clients on regulatory issues such as licensing and compliance relating to money transmission, virtual currencies, foreign exchange, bank and trust matters, and anti-money laundering. He also advises clients on consumer protection and privacy matters, such as compliance with UDAP, CCPA, GLBA, privacy laws, and biometric laws. Next, we have Nicole Murphy. Nicole Murphy is a financial industry veteran of nearly 17 years. She has experience with traditional financial firms like TD Ameritrade, E-Trade, and Morgan Stanley, as well as new fintechs like Cash App and eToro. Nicole currently serves as a Chief Compliance Officer and AML Compliance Officer at eToro, where she brings her extensive knowledge and expertise in a variety of assets and businesses, including equities, options, fixed income, futures, and cryptocurrencies. Jorgan Norgaard. He leads the compliance and risk functions at Alviere. He is a seasoned executive with over 20 years of experience in the global financial industry, specializing in regulatory, AML, KYC programs, and risk management. With a track record leading compliance, KYC, AML, and sanctions teams, he has developed robust compliance policies to drive suitable operational success. With previous roles at World Remit, JP Morgan Chase, and Citi, he is known for his strategic leadership in operational management and effectiveness in engaging with regulators. He is a chairperson of the Money Services Business Association and Board of Directors. This is our wonderful panelists. At your leisure here, you're welcome to also provide any additional comments and questions that you may have. We have a number of those that have been provided in advance of the webinar, and so we do plan to touch on as many as we can work into the session today. So with that, I'll turn it over to your moderator, John Ashley.
Brandi, thank you very much for the introduction. Hello to everyone in our audience, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd like to get through. First, this webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording shortly after the webinar has concluded. Secondly, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to post questions that you would like the panel to answer. We will try our best to get through them at the end of the webinar, although as Brandi mentioned, we have a number of other questions that were also submitted to us before the start of the webinar that we'd like to address as well. And without further ado, let's dig into managing the state examination process. So, state exams, they are a fundamental part of your financial institution's relationship with your regulators. They're required by statute, but it's important to note that these exams are not just a check-the-box exercise. They are fundamentally risk-based, both in terms of regulatory requirements. So, for instance, certain institutions will be considered as higher risk inherently, will undergo more frequent examinations, and also in terms of your firm's unique risk level, what the regulators know and consider about your inherent riskiness from their previous interactions with you and the data they have on you. These could be the reports you filed with them, complaints they've received from your customers, data from previous exams, even down to stuff like, doing basic open source internet research on your company. And the other thing to really, keep in mind about these as we dig into them is that the exams are based fundamentally on the principle of safety and soundness. The regulators are trying to ensure that your business does not pose a risk to the residents of their state who might wish to be your customers or who already are your customers. This means that the exam has numerous components to it beyond just the bread and butter of the chief compliance officers, like beyond AML, BSA, and OFAC. The exams consider your operations, your financial health, your consumer protection measures, information security, all sorts of things. These days, exams are generally run along a uniform line through the state examination system in NMLS, with a few exceptions out there, such as regulators in Florida and New Jersey who don't currently participate in the NMLS. However, chances are, if you are a state-regulated financial institution in the audience today, you deal with most of your communications through regulators through NMLS. So, Daniel, I'd like to kick it over to you for the first question here. With your background, in the regulatory space, we talk about this concept of risk quite a bit in compliance. It's sort of like a universal piece of lingo for us. What are the risks that regulators specifically take into account when they're scheduling and scoping an exam, and how do they evaluate those risks?
Sure. So scheduling and scoping are kind of two separate considerations. For scheduling, the risks that go into the decision when to regulate you, and just to be clear, most of the state statutes, maybe all of them, don't specify exactly how often you need to be examined. So it's kind of up to their internal matrices and decisions like that. Often it depends a lot on things like workload, simply how many examiners they have and how many examinations they have to get through. So it's really hard to predict. I would say on average, probably about once a year for most states. Sometimes it can be 18 months if your last exam was, you were very highly rated. It could be less if there were significant matters requiring attention. And that brings me to like the single most important factor in scheduling for a regulator would be the last exam. If the previous exam you were rated well and everything was honky-dory, they're not going to prioritize you over someone who's in a troubled state. The reverse is also true. If your last exam was not so good, you're probably going to come up again sooner than more highly rated examinees. In terms of scoping, if this is your first exam, the scope is going to be pretty broad because they need to get to know your business. Right now, all they have is your written business plan. So the good news is this gives you an opportunity to frame the narrative and explain your business. If it's not your first exam, then the scope will, again, depend a lot on your previous exam. If there were matters requiring attention, especially violations of, significant violations of law, those are going to be top of the list. I often see if their workload is heavy, a state regulator will do a limited scope exam just touching on those outstanding issues. So those are sort of the general guidelines.
Yeah. And I want to put a pin in that phrase you use about framing the narrative, because that's something that's going to come up quite a bit in today's discussion on, in terms of managing that relationship from the licensee side with the regulators. So, Jorgan, Nicole, real quick, I'd like to ask both of you, say, to those members of our audience who might be getting ready for their first exam, what's a quick piece of advice each of you would want to give them? Nicole, you first.
Sure. I definitely, and I know that some of the content, and I don't want to steal anyone's thunder for the content that we're going to share, but I genuinely think that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. As cliche as that sounds, you are going to reap all of the dividends for all of the work that you put in at the beginning of the exam. So preparation is incredibly key. I also think it's really important to manage expectations. And with that, kind of looking at not only making sure you're keeping those your internal business partners informed, and they know what's going on, but also managing the expectations with the exam team, because to that, you're managing that their perception is reality, and that may not be true, and kind of being able to identify that, and again, kind of controlling and playing more offense than defense is going to be a good position to be in.
Yeah, definitely.
I'll take it. Taking on top of Nicole's point of view, I think really that framing that narrative is key about how you come to the regulator from the preliminaries, when you gather all the documentation and you're sending, but then when you have that first meeting face to face, you got to be very open. I'm with Nicole, like go on the offensive, try, tackle the hard issues that you have already found internally, bring them out there, frame them, and come back with a plan. Always come with a plan. If you're going to talk about something, you have a solution to that something. It's not just an open-ended, like, oh, we got this issue. That shouldn't happen in our conversation with the regulator.
Yeah, no, those are both great points. And we'll definitely dig into, a lot of what both of you brought up as we get further in the discussion here. But speaking of documentation, so the life cycle of the exam starts with, well, you get notified that you are being examined. For the vast majority of institutions, this will come in the form of an initial sort of informal contact from the regulator reaching out to you to try and schedule out, okay, hey, we're thinking of, second week of May this year. Does that work for you, et cetera, et cetera. Once the scheduling details have been ironed out, sometime later, usually about like 2 or 3 weeks, you'll get what's called an entry letter. This is the official notification that the examination is going to start. And this is where all the hard work begins, because this entry letter is going to come with a list of information and documentation requests. And this can run, on average, 120 items, but it can go up to 150 to 170, because it depends, again, like Daniel was talking about earlier, the regulator's impression of you, particularly if this is not your first exam and they have repeat issues they want to come back and look at, but also depending on their specific state requirements for this. You can generally expect, however, that your entry letter and the documentation requests are going to cover the following areas: financial condition. This is your financial statements, your accounting practices. Again, it goes back to the whole concept of safety and soundness. Corporate operations. This talks about your management, your business model, your internal flows of funds, your qualifications, your staffing. Compliance. This is the thing that a lot of us, both on this panel and I would imagine in the audience here, this is what we do day in and day out. This is your BSA AML. This is your onboarding and transaction monitoring. This is your OFAC screening. This section is going to cover everything from you trying to show the regulator how your compliance program works, to you providing the regulator with data files of your own transactions so they can independently test them to confirm that you are taking an appropriate risk-based approach to your compliance program. Additionally, it can cover areas like consumer protections. This is Regulation E, which we're all very well familiar with. Complaints, cancellations, errors, refunds, all of that good stuff. Recently, most state exams has expanded the program of what they're looking at to include a section that is heavily focused on information security and technology. Obviously, we all know about New York and its cybersecurity regulations under Part 500, but this has set sort of a trend that many other state agencies have adopted of conducting not quite as heavy investigation as, say, a Part 500 exam under New York would be, but their own review and audit of your information security practices. And finally, for those in the audience who operate using physical locations and agents, you can expect there will be a whole section that will be dedicated to how you pick, supervise, oversee, offboard, and monitor your agents. Once you receive the entry letter, this is where we start to get into something, something Nicole was talking about, which is like, okay, how do you manage this giant request list that you've gotten. First thing, don't panic. It's not as bad as it looks. But the only way it can stay that way is if you develop a consistent plan to manage how you're going to get from the entry letter to the point where you're uploading things to the state examination system or whatever other system the regulator happens to be using. You know, as chief compliance officer, you know, your responsibility, you have to review this and then start assigning it out. And this can definitely involve going across departmental lines to talk with, you know, your finance team, your operations team, your customer service team. It's especially important to note that for those functions, this might be the first time they've ever heard of a regulatory exam, and you have to educate them on what the expectations are here. The next, you know, really important thing is set deadlines and track these requests to make sure that you have enough time to get them, review them, you know, both for a basic sanity check and as we'll also talk about, you know, to identify potential problems. And Jorgan, you mentioned this a few moments ago. It all in order to get them to the regulators by the deadline specified in the entry letter, because that's when they are going to start reviewing them in preparation for the on-site. So, Nicole, you have set yourself up wonderfully for this question. So I'd like you to expand on what you just you mentioned. Like, okay, you get this entry letter, 150, 170 items on there. What are the best practices you would recommend for managing this sort of pre-examination phase?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it comes to the managing to those deadlines, right? So I'm going to be looking at, and I think some people maybe when you have tracking the requests, right? Maybe don't overcomplicate that. It can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet with a few columns and headers on there so then that way you've got a way to try to stay organized. Because in my experience, sometimes your organization is going to help you and help the exam team who may not be as well organized. So I think kind of assuming that the exam team is going to be organized for you is not a safe assumption to make. So I definitely will look at things, and just knowing and being familiar with my business, I know immediately where the low-hanging fruit is, and I'm going to try to centralize those and get those out the door as fast as we can. I also want to identify on the opposite end of that bell curve, the ones that I know are going to either be problematic. Maybe it's a really big data lift. Maybe I know part of the data lives over here and part of the data, the other part of the data lives over there. And we have to try to mesh this together. At least I know for my organization, we are not only spread out across the United States, but we're global. And so you're dealing with potentially logistical, you know, time zone differences and trying to organize those things. So when I find those really difficult ones, again, going back to the previous point of being more offensive than defensive, excuse me, is like, you know, say you've been given 2 weeks to respond, excuse me. I can go to them and say, I know, and here I'm going to be very transparent and explain, I know I'm going to need more time on this item, and here's why, right? It's not that we don't have the information, but I have these couple of considerations. I'm going to get it to you as quickly as I can, but I just may need more time with that kind of managing expectations. So for me, staying organized, as tedious as it sounds, that administrative work of putting stuff into an Excel spreadsheet, making folders in your shared drive, assigning those out and getting the low-hanging fruit done first, and then finding those really sticky, potentially problematic ones and setting the tone and communicating to the exam team. Because again, I find that they're generally quite receptive and understanding. And sometimes they may not have realized what they've asked for, that it is as complex or as burdensome. Maybe they think that you do X monthly, so they ask for 6 months of them, but it's really something you do daily, you know, kind of just being transparent and sharing that so that they have that additional context can kind of help them save them from themselves, which will inadvertently save you and your team a ton of work to not kind of bury them in something that they didn't anticipate getting so much as a response.
Yeah, definitely. Jorgan, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would take another point of view as also to keep your board and your risk and compliance committee updated about what's going on.
Definitely.
That's kind of a key of management expectation at senior leadership as well. Like, hey, this is coming, and you can have open conversations at the committee level or at the board level. Like, these are the risks we think that we have initially. This is what we're going to start delivering. And then it goes also down to, as what Nicole is saying, now we go into the coaching stage, right? You have all these documentations, you do the lift, you put them over across the board, and now you have to train a lot of your teams that, as you say, John, has never been in an audit before. So that's kind of a whole coaching session that needs to be embedded in there.
And we'll touch on this briefly. One thing I would also throw out there is, for items on the request list where it doesn't exist or it doesn't apply, be sure to have a documented answer as to why this doesn't exist and why this doesn't apply. And Danny, I'd like to get your thoughts, like from a regulatory perspective, like what would you expect to see in that sort of like negative affirmation in response to a certain item where it's like, yeah, we don't have this.
Just a clear explanation, like you said. Why? It doesn't have to be, a 10-page legal memo. But if it's a particularly tricky issue, it might be. And feel free to share that. So everything with your examiners is a dialogue. And sort of piggybacking off of what Nicole said, if you don't have something, communicate that and explain why, or why you believe that what you have is not responsive. And then they can come back to you and explain why, well, no, maybe let's broaden the scope of the request a little bit. Or yeah, we want that anyway, even though it, this provision doesn't apply to you, right? It's dialogue. Along with that, I would say like a couple of quick tips on what Nicole said. If the request is for a voluminous amount of data, feel free to talk to the regulator and say, hey, can I give this to you iteratively? Can I give you this year's data? And then next week, I'll give you the last 3 fiscal years, right? They're usually open to that. That allows them to get working and be better prepared for when the exam actually comes than if you just wait until the deadline or ask for an extension. The other thing I would say is legends and keys in these spreadsheets. The way that you categorize and name your columns and stuff like that may not be obvious to a regulator. So I've even seen situations where the client provides like a separate Word document that explains what's in the spreadsheet. That's enormously helpful. So that kind of thing. Any way you can hold the regulator's hand and walk them through it is helpful.
Definitely. Especially if you operate under a business model that they might not necessarily be familiar with. Which I think everyone on this panel has experienced that before. And then, one last point I'll just go over real quick before we move to the next slide is, start preparing your meetings and your demos that you're going to have with your regulators in advance. We have on the slide here, some common examples of what the regulators expect to see. You can also use your own experience and your own, previous interactions with the regulators to say, okay, I know that this regulator is very concerned about X. We need to have a specific meeting about this topic, and we need to prepare for it. And like this level of preparation, I'll go into it more on the next slide, but this needs to be at a high level of professionalism and a high level of detail. So once you have submitted all of your information and documentations, your responses to this giant entry letter, it now goes to the regulators for a phase of review that usually lasts about a month to a month and a half before the on-site happens. Used to be this was you'd have 6 or 7 regulators physically in your office. Now it's much more to regulatory discretion as to whether they want to do this physically or virtually. However, just the fact that the regulators are doing it virtually changes very little about it. You can essentially think of the on-site as a period where the regulators are going to be in intense communication with you, following up with all of their observations on what you've initially provided, and trying to have those meetings and demos with you to really get a good understanding of how your business works. And, when you're getting ready for this, we talked about preparing this, like the specific subject meetings, like, this is how our accounting practice works. This is how we do onboarding. This is how we do transaction monitoring. But additionally, to touch on a point that Jorgan made, you as the chief compliance officer have to prepare your firm in general, especially if it's a physical on-site, where it's highly likely no one below the level of manager has ever interacted with a regulator before and has no idea of what that looks like. Basic pieces of advice I can give there, if you're the CCO, you have to tell the staff, hey, during these 2 weeks, we will have the regulators on site. these are the expectations, make sure that you dress appropriately, make sure that you adhere to the clean desk policy, make sure that, if the regulators start talking to you and it's not about the weather or, hey, where's a good place I can grab a sandwich, that you go and find the CCO or someone from compliance to be with you in that conversation. And then also, Jorgan, I'd like to dig into this more with you, getting your senior management set up, especially if your senior management is not used to regulatory exams, or their idea of regulatory exams is something that's either much stricter or much lighter than a state exam. So, how would you approach that process of preparing your firms, especially when it comes to like the senior management and the board members, like setting and managing their expectations?
Got it. So from the senior management, what we have as a best practice in our team is to coach them. So we will do mock drills of a meeting, like walk us through your treasury process. Let's say we're talking permissible investment. So you got the treasurer into the office, you make him do the presentation, you make him go through the flows, and we start asking the questions that a regulator would ask, right? Are you commingling funds? Are you doing? And we may play it up a little bit, make it a little bit aggressive sometimes as well, because you don't know what you may get, right? So depending on the type of environment you are in, so we really drill down and have them prep for all the details and have back pocket information as well. And also to have certain standard responses if they don't have the information at that moment, right? Like typically it would be like, hey, Jorgan or whoever works with me on that, we'll take note and we'll get back to you with the deliverable and information and whatnot. Never make stuff up. That's rule number one. Never. If you don't know, just saying we have to look at it, we'll get back to you. That's kind of that in terms of that. Also at the senior leadership team, when you're talking board of directors, usually they're not going to be at the meetings. That's not where you want them to be. It's just keep them appraised. So I think part of once we're in the exam week, the routines tends to be, in our case, we do have morning meetings, like here's everything we came from yesterday. But then we also have an end of day meeting, like this is what we take away as deliverables for tomorrow, like this 24-hour cycle that we're looking for to complete as well.
I also want to touch on a point that was brought up earlier, like, when you're preparing, your senior management and the board ahead of the examination, how do you go about telling them, hey, we've identified a problem during document production and it's potentially a serious problem? How do you manage that conversation?
So here's what I call then, and to me, it's that what's the culture of compliance within the organization you're working with?
Yeah.
And how open is it to hear the bad news? In a good environment, you shouldn't have those surprises, John. Honestly, you shouldn't come to documentation period like, oh my God, we're missing like this key component here.
Yeah.
But if it happens for whatever reason, let's say some system was shut down and nobody realized that the system was shut down, well, you got to deliver the bad news, but without, being inflammatory about it. You just got to be very factual. This is what we see. These are the potential consequences. This is the remediation plan we need to put in place now, so that when the examiners come in, we already have it at least on its way to be fixed, right? And recognize that, hey, this happened. There's a mistake. I think you earn a lot of goodwill being open about it. That has been my experience.
Yeah, I think that if I might add, like that level of transparency is incredibly beneficial. I think when you're able to, I kind of remind people that, we all have a very strong desire we all want to do the right thing, right? That's why we're in the roles that we're in, but nobody gets it right 100% of the time. So striving for perfection, and kind of reminding either, you're talking to the board, you're talking to the senior management team, or even if you're talking to the regulators, I think not losing sight of that perspective, that context is so important to make sure that you're not the first firm to probably get it wrong, right? It's really how you react to it. And that's where I think, Jorgan, your point on coming to them and say, we identified this, hey, our testing or your examination, this process worked. It's why they do these things, is to potentially find these issues so that we can be better, right? And we're going to come out better on the other side of that. And just making sure that people hear that regularly from you as the CCO, kind of championing, kind of quarterbacking, being the coach, whatever, however you're kind of best to view it. I think hearing that reassurance kind of keeps everyone calm. So then that way there isn't that snowball panic, knowing where the landmines are, being transparent and open and honest about those landmines is always going to serve you well internally and externally when talking to your leadership or to the examiners.
And I would like to add, Nicole, on that, and a little bit to what Daniel was saying, it also depends on which stage your company is at, right? If you have a fairly mature
Agreed.
company, I posit that the regulator is going to be less tolerant about some fundamental fails, right? It's like, dude, you've been here 20 years doing this, 30 years doing this, and really you're missing this item. And when you come more to the fintech space where I'm operating now, like if you're a Series B type of company, you have 4 years, 5 years of existence. It's more of a tumble world, rough world that you need to really, you're still building that culture of compliance and understanding what it means to be a regulated entity and how that works. So that's also, you got to play with that context as well when you do it.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely. So when you are now in the exam week, your life is going to consist of two things: meetings and follow-up to meetings. So, we talked earlier about the importance of taking a very assertive approach when it comes to managing the on-site portion, and also having your meetings prepared beforehand. My approach to managing on-site has basically been, after the initial kickoff with the regulators, sending an email saying, hey, this is our proposed meeting schedule. We'd like to cover, KYC on this day at this time, transaction monitoring here, finance here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is what we propose to cover in the agenda, but please let us know what else you would like us to touch on based off of your documentation review. One of the things that I've always found to be very helpful during this portion is you assign some person to essentially be the guy who is in charge, or gal or whoever is in charge of tracking the request, because requests can come in a number of ways, and depending on who, like, each regulator is going to have a different way of viewing, okay, how serious is this? I've had some exams I've been in where, like, one verbal request, which I thought was just a one-off, remark, ended up coming back a few days later. It's like, well, we asked for this. Where is it? It's like, oh, I didn't think that was important. So, another best practice here is sync with the regulators. At the end of the day, you have your spreadsheet or your project management system or whatever you're using, and you say, okay, this is what I have currently outstanding. This is what we delivered to you today. Does this match up with what you have? Because, I guarantee you someone on the exam team also has that job as well. And they'll have their spreadsheet and they'll have their list that you'll have to cross-check against.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jorgan.
Yeah, if I can add, so this is my personal preference. We designate a single point of contact with the team examiners who said, this is the person, but we also put a very hard disciplines in terms of after each and every meeting, we try to confirm what is the item that you want delivered, because I have had the same experience as you, John, like an off-the-cuff remark, and nobody like thought about it, and then 3 days later, like, okay, where is this? And everybody's looking at like, what are you talking about? So very precise. After each meeting, we kind of take 5 minutes of the meeting time, like, what are deliverables from this? A, B, and C, and then also get the proper context, because it's a conversation you're having. You may understand something that you think that is what you have to deliver, and they may have a totally different view of what that we're asking for. And given the quick 24-hour turnaround, I think it's critical to really have that 5 minutes, 10 minutes conversation. Okay, so you were asking about X, Y, Z. We think we're going to deliver you in this terms. This is what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Yep.
And one other point I'd also like to bring up on this slide is when we're talking about the demos, like making sure that whoever the demonstrator is on your side is completely prepared. Like, one of the first pitfalls I ever encountered, this is my second, third state exam when I was a young wet behind the ears compliance analyst, was someone had a tab open with another customer's information on it that wasn't relevant to the demo. And the regulator started asking, well, can you show me that? I want to see that. It was like, well, we weren't prepared to discuss this at all. It just happened to be some extra work that analysts have been working on at the time they've done the demo. So like making sure it's like, okay, like a great example, like let's say you want to give a regulator an exam, like a walkthrough of your onboarding. All that your analyst should have up is the customer in question, various tabs referencing various steps, like let's say a tab that pulls up what your software did with the ID or whatever you received. That is all, that should be the entire universe at that point.
Yes.
Same thing for like, let's say you're trying to walk the examiners through transaction monitoring. You know, you pick one alert that everyone in the room, including the CCO, the manager, whoever, they know it very well. And we can say, okay, we've done this time and time again. This is what the analyst did. It moved to investigation. This is what the investigation looked like. It moved to SAR. Here's the SAR narrative, and so on. So you keep it very controlled because you want to be able to give the regulator a very clear impression of this is how your processes work. And having extraneous information there is just going to complicate things.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Nicole.
If I might add, to your point, being able to control that narrative, one of the best practices that I thought of when you were kind of saying that I found is, again, that using that AML alert, right? And showing it, okay, it generated here and that whole life cycle, taking screenshots of your systems and putting that into a slide deck allows you even more so, because I think we've all kind of been bitten by the, oh, well, we'll just log into our alert system and I'll pull up this particular account. And who knows, maybe there's additional alerts that have happened since then. Maybe you have no idea what's on the other side of that live log. And I found an overwhelming majority of the time, they are satisfied with the screenshot. Okay, you say you have these 3 systems, you showed me through and you've already done the work for them and prevented them from saying, hey, can you give us screenshots or walk us through? They can actually see the system. You have a nice, deck to be able to produce to them at the end of the meeting. And occasionally they've wanted a walkthrough, but I think, again, it really mitigates the unknowns or those variables that you just can't account for. You don't know what's going to happen when you log into your back office system or an alert, those unpredictables. It helps mitigate that a lot. And I think kind of talking to people and coaching them through some of those other, do's and don'ts. Another thing that I found is when you have that and you're not controlling the story and giving them something to look at and you're just talking, I found that a lot of regulators will sometimes go into very nuanced and hyper specific what ifs and hypotheticals. And I think kind of realizing that when it's happening is important to kind of draw back to the example that you have here. And, I find a good deflection for that is, well, if you submit that request in writing, we're happy to answer that for you, as opposed to, being able to say, that's a very specific question. Let me get back to you. I don't know the answer right off the top of my head. I think, again, our inclination is to give you the right answer all the time. And maybe the right person isn't in the room, or maybe you're 92% sure of what the answer is. But until you have trust but verified on what you're going to provide them, then you say, okay, I think I know the answer, but I need to confirm a few things and come back to you, and not be afraid to say that, or ask for clarification. Let me rephrase the question. I understand that you're asking for what happens when X plus Y, right? And being able to kind of cut through some of the rabbit holes that the regulators might go down during that live demo that's happening.
Yeah. And then to sort of touch on a few other points that we have been brought up during the conversation, while the exam is going on, you should do the best you can to manage it. And the best way you can manage it is by trying to track the tone. So a lot of this is nuts and bolts, like making sure you're getting your requests satisfied on time. If a regulator brings something up that they consider to be an issue, especially something simple like fixing one sentence in a document, go ahead and do it. And just say, hey, 2 hours later, hey, we fixed it. Here's the new document. You can see the red line here. And then issue's done, not going to come up in your report. And, it does foster a good relationship, because the regulators see that you are being responsive to their observations here. And then internally speaking, Jorgan, you brought this up earlier, but making sure at the end of the day, not only that you're notifying your key stakeholders like your board members and your other members of senior management as to, hey, this is what's going on, but also to make sure that you are internally within your compliance team, making sure, okay, got our meetings done, what's the status of the request list? And then, from my perspective, this is a chance where, you as chief compliance officer, BSA officer, whatever your title happens to be, you can use this as a teaching experience for your team, because chances are your compliance analysts haven't done this ever and they are very confused. And because, we're compliance people, it's like, well, the regulators are here. Maybe this isn't good. And you can use this as a learning experience for them to say, no, this is perfectly standard. Here's what we looked at. Here's why it's important. Here are the takeaways. So we talked a lot, Jorgan and Nicole, from the licensee side of things. Daniel, I'd like to flip it over back to you and say, from the regulatory standpoint, can you talk about what are the regulators looking at here? What are their, sort of strategies, and how are they approaching the exam?
They're approaching, I like to think of it as somewhere halfway between cops and part of your team, somewhere in the middle there, right? It's collaborative from their view. They're working with their licensees to make sure that their licensees are safe and sound and operating in a compliant manner. They want you to succeed. They're not there to spring a trap on you and, oh, here's a gotcha moment, right? They're not just looking for violations. So, and keep that in mind, even if there are weaknesses, like Jorgan said, if you've got some gaps, be proactive about them, bring them up front. The regulators do appreciate that. If it looks like you're hiding the ball, they're immediately going to wonder what else you're hiding. So you sort of treat it as part collaboration, but just with a little more caution than you would have when you're dealing with your independent review, for instance.
Yeah, definitely. All right. So congratulations. You've made it through the on-site period, the most intense week or 2 weeks of your life. So what happens at this point is the regulators will conduct the exit meeting, which is essentially a preliminary discussion of their findings, violations, and recommendations. It's important to note here that this is a violation of law. You have done something that is contrary to a statute or regulation. From a compliance officer standpoint, this is the most important thing to address. A finding is somewhere a little bit less serious than that, but still something that you are required to fix. Recommendations, and we'll talk more about this on the next slide, these are essentially the regulators saying, hey, we think you should do this. But fundamentally, it's up to you whether or not you accept the recommendation. And we'll talk more, again, the next slide about scenarios in which that may or may not make sense for you to do. One thing to note is that this exit meeting and the exit memo that goes with it is basically, I like to think of it as this is the report of exam light. About, in my experience, 90% of what is in, if not more of what is in this exit memo, is usually what ends up in the report of examination. So, tactically, you as the compliance officer can use this as an opportunity to start getting ahead of the ball game here and just fixing things. For one thing, it's standard practice amongst regulators. They'll give you the exit memo, a few hours before the meeting happens. You've got a few hours. You can grab your team and say, okay, how do we fix all this stuff? So that way you can come to the exit meeting prepared to say, all right, we understand everything you said. This is what we fixed in the last 3 hours, which if you can do that, it looks great. And then this is our plan for addressing the rest of this. The other thing to note is, again, the exit meeting is preliminary, and there may be certain things, and I know this has happened to me in a couple past exams, where there will, if there are pending requests out there from the exam portion, and if those are, important to the regulators, those might end up working their way into the report of exam. So, one thing you want to make certain is you get your request list as tied up as possible before you get into the exit meeting, and then that you try to wrap up any outstanding items as soon as you can after the exit meeting. The last thing you want is for it to be, 60 days from now, and you still haven't responded to a couple of very important requests, and the regulator is like, well, it's time for me to start writing this report, and I haven't received this. So, well, as one regulator told me during my very first state exam, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So Jorgan, Nicole, thoughts on, advice for the audience on how to manage like this sort of preliminary report process and issue management process?
Nicole, you want to go first?
Sure. I find this is like the best opportunity to, sometimes I think we can all be very reasonable and understanding and say, okay, we agree. Yes, like there was an issue with this documentation. And again, showing that you're going to be proactive as much as you can and mitigate it, right? But I also think, because I'm hard pressed to think of an exam where there wasn't something where they had assumed maybe the documentation they gave them was one thing. And so they thought, oh, well, it's missing X, but however, X was not in their original request, so you didn't provide it. So then they're writing you up because you don't have X included in your data set or whatever it might be. And you're able to say, oh no, I have that, right? And this is the chance to get those things off of the report or correct misunderstanding. And, sometimes it's easy to maybe lose patience because usually if it's a problematic issue, you've probably talked to them about it 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, right? And you feel like you've repeated yourself. Trust me, doing it one more time may be exactly what you need because they may have that moment, and it saves you from having a violation or a finding again, because some of those things can eventually snowball into getting into fines, and you naturally don't want that to happen over an assumption, an incorrect not ill-intended assumption that the regulator has made in the documentation you provided. So a great chance to be corrective and to re-explain something in the chance that it can then clarify and clean things up and you don't have that finding. So don't be afraid to advocate, again, and that's kind of unfortunately kind of a judgment call on when to kind of push back on when you disagree. And I find at times when I do disagree, asking questions help me understand how, to understand their perspective and ask questions, because naturally you're going to have to be trying to explain that to your senior leadership team as well. But I also think sometimes hearing those questions and hearing the perspective of the firm is incredibly beneficial and potentially eye-opening, where the regulators may not have thought about it that way before. And it challenges them to really, if you're going to put a finding on one of my reports, you kind of have to really earn it, in my opinion. But you can do that respectfully and professionally and not be abrasive or impatient when you're going through that process.
I'm going to go there with Nicole. Never lose patience. Never. Even if it's kind of, as you said, it could be you have already discussed it 5 or 6 times. You're feeling it's getting contentious, but you've got to absolutely stay cool about it. Just have the conversation, put out the facts. And I think exactly the exit memo is a good opportunity to narrow down. As you say, subjective, some battles you may not want to choose. Maybe some minor findings you will say, you know what, whatever, that's not worth it. But it's like, put an example, if it's a financial issue, like something about your permissible investments, or it's like a more significant type. Yeah, you got to talk it through. You got to really ask them, why are you thinking this, and then use that moment to clarify before they walk outside from the onsite. That's absolutely what.
And I think sort of my commentary on this is especially applicable to those in the audience who are in fintech, and particularly if you have new, like, novel business models, crypto or just something that is the regulators don't have context for. It's like their questions are not the fact that they don't trust you. It's that it's an opportunity for you to educate them.
Yeah, I kind of tell people that we're like a teaching hospital. We need to educate. And that's also too, we're kind of going back to that kickoff meeting. I've had examiners say that they don't even want one. And I will always insist, because it sets the tone to set the record straight on not only what your business model is, but also what it isn't. Because again, it's never safe to assume that, oh, well, of course they're coming in to examine me. They've read the business plan. That means they know and they understand my business. They don't. I can rest assure you that they don't. So like I said, it's that chance to frame that narrative, and that you've done at the beginning of the exam that will come in so handy when you're coming here to the exit and what might actually show up as a finding.
Yeah, I like Nicole's, like, never assume anything. Don't project that they actually understand what you're doing or what your business is doing. They don't. They look at so many that it's very hard for them to really get into the details.
Exactly. So the report of examination, and what are you supposed to do with this? The biggest thing with the report is you're required to provide a written response that outlines how you're going to essentially address everything that is brought up, whether it's a violation or finding, which is top priority, or whether it's a recommendation, which is not mandatory for you to address. You know, Jorgan, to your point earlier, some recommendations are simply hills that you don't want to die on, and it's something you can fix. Yes, it will make someone's day very annoying for 8 hours, but it's done. The flip side of this, though, with recommendations is, at least in my experience, it's important not to overcommit to them, especially if it's a recommendation that involves having to cross collaborate with other departments or draw on other departments' resources, which they might not necessarily have. Fundamentally, though, the thing with the management action plan is it should be complete. It should have deadlines. It should have responsible persons. It's basic project management, but it's also important because this will be requested in your next exam, and your independent auditors are also going to request it. Daniel, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about like the differences between a violation, a finding, and a recommendation, and how licensees should approach like addressing those, and communicating that in the management action plan.
Sure. And this will also, not just in the management action plan, but also in how you respond to your exam report to the regulator. So, violations are, as you might expect, just violations of a statute or a regulation. You are supposed to maintain books and records for 3 years. You don't have anything older than 2 years. Findings can be sort of somewhere in the middle, at least I find from a legal perspective. Might be something like you're supposed to have due diligence on your foreign correspondence. And in your view, you don't have foreign correspondence, but the regulator says, nope, these companies you did business with are correspondents. That's the kind of thing that escalates to me as the attorney. And I wouldn't commit to, same as what was just said. Basically, don't overpromise in your action plan if you need to iron out an issue with the regulator. Get legal involved and figure out, is this actually a violation? Should this be considered a finding? In terms of recommendations, I also like communication with the regulator. Sometimes their recommendations look obvious and easy to understand on the surface, right? Sometimes you don't know why they're recommending this, or maybe it indicates that they didn't quite get a particular aspect of your business model. So even though the report of examination has come out, it's not too late to provide a written response or pick up the phone and say, this recommendation, I'm not sure I get what you're getting at here. And then you can memorialize that in your written response to the ROE. So those are just sort of the general approaches that I consider.
Excellent. One last thing I'd like to talk about, and I'm going to move through this fairly quickly because we've got a lot of questions from the audience, both before the webinar and during the webinar, that I'd like us to do our best to tackle. So I'd sort of like to conclude here by saying that, the report, you shouldn't look at the report of exam and the exam in general as an unwanted audit. This is much more like a true audit. It is designed for you to, if you approach it correctly, to identify areas where you can improve, both in terms of using the report of exam and your experience during the exam to say, hey, is there something weird going on here with our firm in general that we didn't quite get to it, but we need to dig into further because it might come up. This can be everything from, okay, maybe we got a bunch of recommendations clustered around transaction monitoring. Might be a time to take a deeper look at transaction monitoring, to just things like, oh, the regulators had a lot of questions about, like, this particular payout correspondent that we use in this country. Maybe it's time to do some due diligence on them. The other thing that you can use the exam report for is, this is a way to build consensus within your organization to drive change. Like, if you're getting consistently, written up in your reports for your manual transaction monitoring process is not sufficient to handle the level of business you're dealing with, well, you can say, hey, this has come up in 3 separate reports of exam over the course of 3 years. Maybe it's time we start budgeting, like talking about budget allocation for a vendor and stuff like that. However, let's move on to some questions. We had a couple that I'd like to address first that were submitted before the webinar. And I'll just throw this open to the entire panel here. Although I would also say, let's keep in mind, we've got about 5-7 minutes left. So let's try and be a bit concise with this. First one, this is a very good question. Is it better to plan for subject matter expert interviews across business units for full scope examinations, or should the compliance officer be prepared to speak to compliance across the business?
I can take it if you want to, John. I think you have to, our practice is you have to coach your heads of functions to talk to it. The compliance officer cannot know all the level of details that they may know, and it actually takes away one barrier that the regulator might find, that if it's you who's talking to everything, they might find it like, yeah, but we want to talk to the guy anyway, so to go. So just have them, coach them, prepare them, and put them in front of the regulators. That will be my take personally.
Yeah.
I would just add something I think you said earlier, Jorgan, that your compliance officer should hopefully be in the room while
Absolutely.
that's happening.
Always.
Because
Yes.
they're the glue. They can connect the regulatory requirements with what this, maybe technical or operational person is saying.
Correct. Yeah. We always have in our practice, we always have one compliance officer with the subject matter expert. They're never alone in the room.
Yeah. I would just say, like, my personal experience managing exams has been, I know enough about every part of my organization to be very dangerous, and you should never ask me to talk about it. You should ask them. But to the point, you should always have the compliance officer there to help. Essentially, like, I would say, like, glue is a good metaphor. I like the metaphor of translation. The compliance officer understands the money transmission statutes and the compliance requirements for it, and they can communicate that to, say, the finance person who's there. Next pre-submitted question I'd like to go to, and Nicole, I'd like you to answer this first, then Jorgan, you next. What are some of the top exam topics/concerns trending in the industry?
So I think the financial piece for sure. They're really wanting to, you'd have to be living under a rock to not hear about big headlines of FTX and commingling. Like, what are you doing to not only make sure that you have separation, but that you have preventative controls to make sure that someone can't, get their hand in the metaphorical cookie jar that shouldn't. So that one has definitely been there. Not to anyone's surprise either, at least for me anyway, been very hot and heavy in the AML BSA space. I mean, that is just continuously evolving. And really what they're trying to also make sure is that you're not setting and forgetting, right? I think that's kind of been a big theme within specifically like transaction monitoring, that you're going back and, hey, that threshold that you set 2 years ago, does it still make, do you even have a process to look at that to see if it still makes sense? And that you have kind of that good self-governance in some of those spaces. And then kind of to the broader picture, I would say governance. So I know we have a question here that a little bit when it comes to what does the board know? What are your risk or compliance committees? What are the escalate when there's a problem? Do you have infrastructure in place to make sure that there is a, you're keeping that in mind and that it's part of the culture, part of the DNA, and that there's infrastructure to support it. So at least for me, those are kind of some big 3 topics. Jorgan, did you have any others to add?
I'm with you. I'm absolutely with you that the financial is a hard one coming up constantly. And now also in the fintech space as well, it's also your financial viability. How well are you able to?
How liquid are you?
Yeah. What's your burn rate? How are you going to raise? How are you going to work? That becomes a big one. And then on the AML and transaction monitoring is, do you have the authority as the chief compliance officer? Can you get budget? Can you get resources? Because exactly what you're saying, John, hey, we have written you up 3 times because you keep on doing manual reviews. You have spreadsheets and you're running in the hundreds of thousands of transactions every month. How are you really keeping track of that? So those are really hot topics that are recurring in the field right now.
And I think we have time for one last question. Daniel, I'd like you to take lead on responding to this if you don't mind. So the question is, how much hygiene do you recommend having with regards to board and committee meeting and minutes? For example, ensuring you provide the regulators the appropriate amount of information without airing issues that may lead to heightened scrutiny during exams.
Well, I think you should keep in mind that, board and committee meeting minutes generally, they're primarily a tool for you. So you need them to document what you need them to document. I would err on the side of including more information. If there's if that includes information that's off topic or out of scope, then you might even take the step of redacting certain portions of the meeting minutes and provide that to the regulator, and then let them ask, what's this redacted stuff? And you say, that's, we're talking about an HR problem that is unrelated to, or if it's something that is related to the scope of the exam and it doesn't look good, chances are that's going to come up during the exam anyway. And that goes back to what Jorgan said at the beginning about being proactive. So I wouldn't worry overly much about cleaning up your meeting minutes and your board resolutions and things like that. You kind of need that documentation.
And if I may jump in, John, on Dan's point, I actually think that 2 clean board minutes, like that don't show any type of risk,
Yes,
that can raise a flag as a
that's
lack of.
very suspicious. Yes.
Yeah, that's a red
It will
flag.
come back to
We
bite
had
you, for
0
sure.
problems this year. We had nothing to talk about. Yeah, that looks bad.
Yeah. I believe we are at time here, so I will turn it back over to Brandi.
So I'd like to thank you for attending today. If we did not get to your questions, we are more than glad to follow up. So just send a note if you like follow-up information from us or any of the panelists. Also, we will have additional webinars coming up, so please stay tuned for more exciting topics. And if you have anything in mind that you'd like to hear from the same panelists or others in the industry, please let us know. Thank you for your time.